notes.
Wow. You
The-
did you
These were
did notes and show prep?
these were my notes live as I was watching the bracket reveal. So we can talk about that.
Let's write this down. On March 3rd, Zach did show prep.
It's a fun time in the Division 3 basketball season, and we are so glad you're choosing to spend some time with us during it. Looking forward to this time of year. The next couple weeks should be epic. Matt, we had a big release today. It's the thing everyone's talking about. It's the latest top 25 D3hoops.com poll. You're a voter. Everyone's tuning in because they want to know, how did Matt vote in this poll that they've already seen?
Zach,
So let's just, in all seriousness, let's for the sake of completeness, actually, you can reveal your ballot here, Matt. But I think I said this last year. Like, this is a top 25 poll. I have absolute zero interest in. But hey, we've talked about it every week along the way here. So let's just knock this out, and then we're gonna dive right into some bracket talk, some bracket analysis, some bracket reactions, Matt, and then we're gonna go into our deep dive into the first round matchups. We're going to use the efficiency ratings that are run by the D3 Datacast computer. And we're going to dive into those first round matchups and look at, based on those efficiency ratings, who are the favorites. Like, we're going to look at a computer line for every single game. We're going to look at each team's offensive efficiency rating, defensive efficiency rating, break it all down, look into those numbers to see where some of the really interesting matchups might be. And it's going to be fun. I always enjoy this show, and it's a great time of year. But let's do a little housekeeping, get this top
yeah.
25 nonsense out of the way.
Well, it kind of snuck up on me, right? We did our live show on Sunday as the games were going on. We finally got off the air. We were running NPI throughout the entire day. And then later on, to get the email from Pat Coleman of D3Hoops.com saying, here's the top 25 information and voting link. And he himself had been just like hosting Hoopsville then that night. Everyone was busy in the D3 Hoops world because it's such a fun day when you get the final championships in Selection Sunday. So, yeah, the top 25 does even sneak up on me as a voter. But here's my ballot, and actually big news for me up at the top, Zach. Wesleyan did take that loss, and I think that was enough for me. I'd been talking for a few weeks about the top three being a group, and I did jump UW Platteville into the top spot. And it's interesting, we get to talk about my top 25 ballot this week because of the nature of our show after the ballot, the poll has been released. Usually we're previewing it, my ballot on Monday morning. And we know now that the vote was essentially split between these three teams at the top. It was like 9, 8, and 8. I think it was NYU that got the top spot in the actual, go to d3hoops.com and check out the actual poll and get the vote breakdown and everything. But basically the voters were like one third, one third, one third. And that makes a lot of sense to me too, because it was a really big decision to me. I said, do I keep Wesleyan? Do I move NYU up to number one? Do I move UW Platteville up to number one? I chose Platteville. I think a reasonable person could make a bunch of different decisions. And that's where we landed. So yeah, that was the big mover for me. There was some other things that moved around, but I did want to talk specifically about my number one vote. And then I think we're going to probably get to maybe the bracket stuff, which is everyone's maybe more interested in at this point in the season.
Absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, so let's move into that, Matt. Let's just talk kind of initial reactions. We were, not privy to any sort of embargoed advance thing. We were looking uh, at the live stream just like everyone else, reacting along the way as those were being revealed on the live stream, Matt. Um, so let's just go. If I pull up my notes that I was making, along the way, just live as the show was unfolding, the first thing I wrote down was pairing Wesleyan and Emory, question mark, right? So we talked about this on our live show. Looking at those top 8 seeds, we knew that Wesleyan was going to be one of the top 4, right? And so they would be joined by someone else at the opposite end of that bracket in that 4 through 8 range, and then they wouldn't be on a path to meet the until the quarterfinal, right? And we talked about that wasn't necessarily going to be a 1 and 8 and a 2 and 7, right? There was going to be some other factors involved, including geography, right? So we kind of thought that seeding might hold as long as it worked geographically. And this was an interesting one because Wesleyan entered as the number 1. In terms of seeding, it would have worked out just fine to match Tufts,
Yeah.
who was the number 8 overall seed in there. Instead, we get Emory. Um, Take us into your reaction. I'm guessing that probably kind of raised an eyebrow with you when that came up on screen. as it did for me. The first thing I wrote down. Do you agree? Was that something that was like setting off some not alarm bells, right? Not necessarily. It's just the first thing that was like a little bit different than maybe we expected to see.
Yeah, different than we expected. I think part of that is good, and part of that, to me, is a little bit of a question mark. So the good thing is, I think that means that indicates the committee was allowed, or maybe just took a little bit more freedom to mix up the bracket and wasn't always just strictly bound by geography all the time. So Zach, you and I think kind of assumed that since Hampton Sydney was on the table and that's busable to Emory, that the committee might automatically be forced to kind of do NYU to Hampton Sydney to Emory to make a completely drivable trio there in the sectional weekend, the second weekend, if all the favorites get through. So I think it's sort of good news. We've heard all along, like hosting isn't necessarily guaranteed when you're talking about top 8. It's the matchups that are protected. So this does give a path, which is probably good, to NYU men's team to host the sectional, which we know they're not able to host the first weekend because their women's are in place. But now the geography, because it can't be that direct Emory to Hampton City to NYU, they do have a path to host. But we know that hasn't been promised or guaranteed to anyone in the bracket. So I do like something about the being able to mix geography. But I'm going to do a Stephen A. Smith there. But I think this was such a natural seeding, 1 through 8, Wesleyan and Tufts, that I don't think we had to mix up geography necessarily. It's nice to, and this is not something I'm going to be complaining about, because if in Division 3, we know there's so many constraints. If you can keep a team on the same seed line, like I think there's enough moving around of other seed lines, it's kind of fine. Like, sure, mix up so you don't get maybe a Region 6 matchup. Maybe you're avoiding, just the NESCAC. But again, that would be a sectional final with Wesleyan and Tufts. Like, you don't want to protect that. And I think that would be getting into dangerous territory if the decision is we're protecting the Wesleyan versus Tufts sectional final, because who cares about a potential sectional final, right? If that's a conference matchup, then that's a conference matchup, and I don't care. So I think there's some good in this, but I would have liked to see in this situation, since it was the true 1 versus 8 seeding, like, just go ahead and do that, right?
Well, not to step into a hot button issue, I didn't see a lot of this going around on social media, Matt, but to take that view, right? You did mix up the NESCAC 1 and the NESCAC 2, and the UAA 1 and the UAA 2, right? So
Yeah,
Tufts would
right.
have been a very natural seed in with Wesleyan. Emory maybe would have been a very natural seed in with NYU. And when you look at it in terms of geography and in terms of seeding, it seems like maybe the decision was made on the basis of, hey, we can mix up the conference affiliations here, which, okay, that could be a consideration. The problem, or maybe where some people in other parts of the country are saying, yeah, but hey, what about us, is look over there, we've got Platteville and La Crosse
Yeah,
in the same quadrant.
yeah.
And I guess maybe just having the lack of geographic flexibility forces them where they couldn't go to like that third line of priority to mix things up. But hey, there's a lot of hashtag narratives about there about the NESCAC and the UAAs out there, and it seems like there was some different decisions that were able to be made that were not able to be accommodated in how the UW
Yeah.
top eight overall seeds were handled.
Yeah, and I think that's right, Zach. You're not able to, because that would then be a mandatory flight in the Midwest to move a UW away from each other. And now you're just moving the potential flight for Emory away from Hampton Sydney. So it seems like you're doing that. But I think you're right. It's not a thing that's afforded to other parts of the country. So you get WIAC, and then you sort of intentionally, I don't know what all the reasons were, but you are intentionally then misseeding those 2 seeds to change Emory and NYU. And again, we are very much, this part of it is very much a nitpick, and we're not really complaining about it. We're just talking about it as considerations, because there's going to be a bunch of different decisions the committee could make, a lot of them reasonable. But again, you just think of all the potential choices you could make. You could have naturally paired the 1 and 8, the Wesleyan and the Tufts, and the Emory and NYU. There is some positive to mixing up the potential for conference matchups. But again, if you can't afford that to other teams, then how much do you want to try to do that? The committee did choose to do it in this case. It's fairly reasonable. You're not moving teams off of seed lines. So, but that's just a choice that they did make.
So let's get in and explain kind of the bracket view we have up here. Not a traditional bracket, Matt, but a familiar view for people who have looked at your mock brackets in past. And so what we have here is based on a traditional bracket format, where each seed would be in terms of like 1 through 16, as they were actually placed in this bracket. And then off to the left under that black column in the white text, you have what each team's true seeding would have been based on their final NPI ranking, right? So
Yep.
like 1 through 4 would be the 1 seeds. 64, 63, 62, 61 would be like the true 16 seeds. So we can see a little bit um, how teams compare with their, quote unquote, true seeding based on the NPI rankings and their, let's say, effective seeding based on the placement within the bracket. Now, I know this is the first time with NPI we actually have like a full 1 through 64 true seed based on those NPI rankings. Um, and it's always dangerous to compare Division
Right.
3 to Division 1, but I want to say even in Division 1 there are certain provisions in play that allow the committee, at least based on my current understanding, to move teams, up or down a seed line. So, you know, add in all the other constraints that are very familiar to everyone who's followed Division 3 basketball, and I don't think there's really any reason to haggle over anything that is, a seed line different,
Yeah.
1 or 2 places. But Matt, we can take this where you want to go. But again, just number 2 on the list for me, as I was, jotting some notes. The first thing, kind of maybe that was, I don't want to say misseeding, but where you could see some clear adjustment was when John Jay popped up as the opponent for Christopher Newport. And so let's go to your look in the bracket here. John Jay, I think would have been a true seed, what, 15?
15. Yep.
Yeah, 15. And so it's probably a little bit more of a favorable draw, for Christopher Newport based on their seeding. So that was the first one that kind of, stuck out to me. And then I think I'll let you react to that and any others you want to point out. And I think this John Jay one comes up in another, maybe the biggest one that was a bit of a head scratcher. But
Yeah.
what do you think?
First of all, I think you're right. In Division Three bracket, with all the constraints we have, if you're within a seed line of what your quote unquote true seed should be, I think that's for the most part fine. Anything else, you can just play the fun game of like, well, you could have done this or that. There's so many considerations about hosting and geography. There's only so many things you can do. I always start raising an eyebrow then when you get two seed lines or more, and I want to start to look at what do I think the specific decisions or constraints were that led to that. So I think you're right. One of the things I see just in this bracket overall is I expected a little bit more true seeding of like where the 16s and the 15s would land as far as like the ones versus fives. There's a little bit more mixing up with that. Zach, you pointed out John Jay. I don't think it's a terrible misseed, but yeah, that's like a 15 on a 14 line. I was looking even more like at Bryn Athen, all the way up to kind of what's more like a 14. And I think in the Hampton Sydney line, there was maybe more options you could do there. I'm not sure. Maybe these are not super consequential in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, I was looking at that, and I just didn't really see necessarily a true seeding nature when it came down to the 16s, the 15s, the 14s, even the 13s necessarily.
Now, the other point we need to talk about is there are a lot of places in the bracket where it was very clear the committee was steering clear of rematches that
Yeah,
of games that took place during the regular season. And sometimes that led to some of those instances where they were willing to move a team more than a seed line, right? We saw that we knew going in, like Guilford, Barry, Emory, and Huntington were going to be a pod, just the way the geography worked out, being able to get to Emory, like that was kind of a given going in. But really, we see an opponent swap where it's going to be Guilford getting Barry and Emory getting Huntington, even though the true seeding based on NPI would have had it the other way. Right. So the only explanation I think is that, Emory had already played Barry in the
yeah,
regular season, and so to mix up that first round matchup, away from something that is a game that's already been played, the committee decided to flip those. Um, Now, okay, I mean,
yeah,
I guess that's a decision they could make, and, we already knew that those 4 teams were kinda locked together, probably not a huge deal, but definitely enough of a difference where it was a little bit of an eyebrow raiser and an indication that they were going to be taking first round um, rematches of regular season games very seriously, right? The other place where I thought we saw that in a very big way is with Illinois Wesleyan
Mhm.
drawing Bethany Lutheran, who is one of those teams that, in terms of true seeding, would have been a 16. But when you look at that bracket, number one is Platville, which is a team they had already played in the regular season. And on top of that, was their first round opponent a year ago,
Mhm.
right? So I think that's something else that the committees will often look at to say, hey, was this a tournament game last year? Okay, we're going to try for a student athlete experience, mix it up, right? So for those Bethany Lutheran kids who were in the tournament last year, getting knocked out by Wisconsin Platteville, you can see wanting to mix it up and giving them a chance against someone else specific, especially since it's a team that they had already played this regular season. Go down to the 2 seed there, it's Wisconsin Lacrosse, another team that Bethany Lutheran
Yeah.
has already played in the regular season, right? So that kind of knocks them down to Illinois Wesleyan. Now, I guess you could say that's all fine and good, Matt, but this where this seems like an inconsistency comes is when you look at the 2 seed in that NYU quadrant with Tufts and Yeshiva going there. This is one that doesn't really make sense to me in any of the considerations that we primarily think of in terms of seeding, right? So this is Yeshiva is in terms of their effective seed in this bracket, shifted from like a 14 to a 15, right? So you go back to we talked about John Jay. You got two New York City teams here. You could very easily have swapped John Jay and Yeshiva, and that would have been a better seeding fit. Um, there's also there's also the fact that Yeshiva and Tufts played in the regular
Yeah.
season, right? So it's just very odd to me that this game just isn't a fit when you're looking at seeding, and there's a very clear opportunity. Hey, just flip these two teams. That works better for seeding, and it avoids a rematch of a game that we've already seen this season. Um, it's just very, very odd to me when you can see very obviously other places in the bracket where it was, you know, some pretty different decisions
Yeah.
were made than could have been made to avoid those rematches.
And people, I think Ryan Scott in particular, posted on Twitter that there might be other considerations there, right? Because Yeshiva, part of the observant community, would need to play earlier on Friday because they would want to be back and prepared for sundown, right? But I think so. That's going to be a 1 o'clock tip off. Maybe that there was fewer places that were able to accommodate a 1 o'clock tip off, or maybe other things that were needed. I don't know, but I just have a hard time thinking about where the geography is with New York City and how many different places that they can go.
Right.
That in this case they had to do the regular season rematch because it basically was only allowed for Tufts, and we had to put them down a seed line and do a rematch. I don't know everything that was involved there. Obviously, we don't know all the decisions they had to make, but I think you're right. They very clearly, in a lot of places, avoided rematches, and here was a very specific place where they did not avoid rematches. So I think it just does stand out in that as a choice that the committee had to make.
And then we can talk about there's some alternate hosts chosen due to priority going to women's basketball teams. So the Randolph Macon women are hosting because it's a priority year for the women in the opening round of the or opening weekend of the tournament. So Randolph Macon will be at Franklin and Marshall. NYU will be at a pod hosted by York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois Wesleyan will be on the road at Chicago with their women hosting at Shirk Center.
Yeah, a couple things interesting here. I wasn't sure how they would always bracket these. Is it kind of the next quote unquote deserving host? Maybe that was sort of the case with Randolph Macon being hosted at Franklin and Marshall. But I was kind of impressed that both with Illinois Wesleyan and with NYU, they went to kind of that third team in the pod, going to York, Pennsylvania, and going to University of Chicago. I think in both cases it keeps that top seeded team a little bit closer to home. When you talk about Illinois Wesleyan to University of Chicago, that's probably one of the closer options they had. They could have also gone to maybe Milwaukee. They could have gone to Grand Rapids, Michigan. Those are further away. So I do see some benefit in trying to keep those top seeded teams a little bit closer to home. I don't know if that was the consideration. I think I also had a mock bracket with them going to St. Norbert, which is obviously further away. That's Illinois Wesleyan. So they did maybe opt to keep them closer to home. I think there's some good in that. That also gives them a little bit of creativity when it came to the Illinois Wesleyan pod to bring a team like St. John's into the mix that wouldn't have been in the mix if it had been in Bloomington,
Yeah.
Illinois. That would have been past 500 miles, but Chicago would be close enough that they can both get in there, and then that kind of relieves maybe some seeding pressure in that kind of Midwest quadrant. So I think they did use that really well to their advantage.
Yeah,
Um,
because that that
yeah,
that's some good creativity there, right? 'Cause they can't host, so it's not like they just created a pod that would have been at Illinois Wesleyan and, just move it somewhere else, right? That's a pod that would not have existed
yeah.
at Illinois Wesleyan, and so, we can get a little more creativity. Now, in terms of true seeding, I don't know that St. John's Chicago first round matchup is really quite what you want to see, but,
Well, I mean, here's the
y
thing.
you know
The true seed in that quadrant would have been Carthage, and you don't want to put Carthage in the Illinois Wesleyan pod, so you kind of have to um, make an allowance for St. John's there if you can. So St. John's is a little stronger than a 6. Maybe Chicago's a little worse than a 9, and maybe that's kind of okay in balance. I think I think to me that still kind of works, right? With the geography in the Midwest and what you have to do, moving the teams those seed lines, I think it's kind of like, yeah, that's pretty okay. I think there's maybe other decisions you could make in that whole thing, but overall, I think that's pretty reasonable.
I don't know if there's any other particular matchups you wanna point out, Matt. I know the Roanoke Pfeiffer one was a little bit interesting to you, and you can see that Pfeiffer maybe moved about 3 seed lines to make that one
Yeah.
work out, and,
So
and maybe not completely would have been necessary.
we talked about John Jay, and this is one that really stuck out to me when the show was live. Is why not just make Pfeiffer the 4 seed there, the 14 line to play Christopher Newport, and find another 11 to fit in there. I think you can geographically find someone to go there, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Pfeiffer, or it didn't have to be John Jay. Like I it seems like there is a bunch of things that you could have done geographically there. I didn't quite understand why Pfeiffer got bumped up 3 seeds and what we're necessarily doing there, but yeah,
Well,
that
I mean,
that stuck
you
out
look
to me.
at you look at Claremont Mudd Scripps as an 11, right? They're getting on a plane. Once you're on a plane, you could send them anywhere.
Yeah,
So even if there wasn't maybe a more natural geographic fit
yeah.
to take that 11 spot, you're sending a team anywhere, send them there where it fits.
There's an
Of course,
airport in
where
Newport News. I've flown in there before.
hey, congratulations.
Yeah. Hmm.
Stay tuned for more Matt Snyder travel history. Okay, so any other final thoughts, Matt? I feel like overall, I feel like for the first year where we really have a 1 through 64 true seeding, I'm a little bit maybe underwhelmed isn't the right word. I thought maybe we would see something that was a little bit closer. And I know as we were talking offline, you thought your reaction was maybe that they kind of group teams into more broad buckets than maybe we were
Maybe.
expecting, and
Yeah.
that's kind of how some of those differences came out.
Yeah, I think maybe more the old system. We used to just talk on these are pod number ones, these are pod number twos, these are threes, these are fours, and you kind of bucket them accordingly. I thought with NPI we would be a little bit more precise with our seedings when we have the opportunity to. Of course, we don't know all the considerations that went into it, and I want to say like we're obviously very intentionally like nitpicking here. I think overall the bracket is pretty fair and balanced. It's not like when you go by NPI, you get a really terrible quadrant or you get even really terrible pods. I think overall we're talking about a seed line or two in a few different places where they didn't need to. Um, but again, I think it's overall a good bracket. I think it's a fair bracket. It's going to lead to a good tournament. And just because we are Division III basketball nerds who like talking about this, we enjoy the discussion of deciding those things. We're not trying to put anyone on blast or say that the bracket's bad or anything. I think overall it is pretty good and it is pretty in line. We're just wondering on some of the places where you moved 2 seed lines, could have you only moved one? And when you moved one, did you have to move it all? But again, these are kind of very, very niche. And if some of the answers are we just really wanted to avoid those matchups for the student athlete experience because that's the feedback we've gotten, then great, that's the answer. And then we know, right?
Right. Yeah, we're fortunately a very long way away at this point from brackets of death and
Yes.
things like that.
So much
So,
better than it
uh,
was.
right. So, even in the 3 years we've been doing this show, anything that maybe comes across as criticism of a bracket, really in the grand scheme of things in the history of Division III basketball are very, very, very minor.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for a number of years now we've gotten very good brackets, and I think this is another committee that's done a good job.
Yeah.
The fact that we have certain nitpicks to be able to even talk about is a good thing, and not have to
Yeah.
worry about the major issues where we've got like 7 top 10 teams in one quadrant or
Yeah.
something like that.
And I don't envy the committee because they have to make choices. You can't just do 1 through 64. And no matter what choices they make, there's going to be teams that say, well, you should have hosted here instead of there, or it could have come to us and not there, or we would have preferred this matchup or that matchup. They're going to hear that no matter what. They're going to hear it from coaches, from stupid fans like us. So I don't envy them that, and we appreciate that the work they did, and we know this is going to be a great tournament.
Right. And as you mentioned, we're working with only a portion of the information. They
Yep.
know exactly what the bids were for
Yep.
hosting and what the even within the bids that maybe are able to accommodate, there may be within there some like you talked about with some timing things, like maybe that certain time slots are not available or something like that. So um very interesting, and
Yep.
it's gonna be a great tournament. We got some great matchups. It's gonna be a lot of fun. Can't wait to see it all play out. All right, so let's dive in here. We're gonna go game by game, take a look at all the matchups. Let's start off here with our first round preview in the Wesleyan quadrant. Of course, Wesleyan, the number one overall seed heading into the tournament, based on the NPI rankings at the end of the regular season. They draw Delaware Valley in the first round. The overall efficiency margin ranks Wesleyan number 2, Delaware Valley the 172nd overall Division III basketball team. Matt, and it's no surprise you get that you get a high ranking like Wesleyan is their number
Yeah.
2 overall. They've got the number 2 offense, the number 2 defense. So that's a recipe for getting highly ranked, right? So throw those adjusted efficiency margins into the computer. You can back out a kind of a win probability for each game and a computer line. Uh, for entertainment purposes only, of course.
Yep.
And so based on that, the computer likes Wesleyan 98% chance to win, and a computer line there making Wesleyan 24-point favorites.
Yeah, one of the largest computer spreads that we're probably going to see. Not the largest, but one of the largest. And that's not surprising when you're talking about the number one overall seed, as Wesleyan was by NPI, against Delaware Valley, who was kind of like an upset in the Mac Freedom Conference. They weren't the top seed there, but they get through at 15 and 12. So they probably know they're an underdog going into it. The computers think they're an underdog going into it. Tough when you play a heavy favorite like that on the road. But yeah, the computer thinks Wesleyan 98%, Delaware Valley just 2%. And you can see the team ratings there. Like Wesleyan's great, number 2 rated offense, number 2 rated defense. Delaware Valley's a little bit more like the 100 to 200 range on both of those. So what looks like a mismatch by the computers, but going to be interesting to see what actually happens on the court.
And Matt, I like the way that you've described NPI, right? Because NPI is not necessarily saying a team ranked ahead of another one is better than that team, right?
Yep.
NPI really is a resume metric
Yep.
rather than a team quality metric,
Yes.
right? And hopefully we've cultivated an audience here that is ready to understand and accept that kind of nuance, right? But I think this is the first point where we see it. Chatham is slotted on the bracket, kind of like an 8 seed with 9 seed Gettysburg. But the computer, in terms of the D3 Datacast efficiency ratings, likes Gettysburg as the number 53 overall team compared to Chatham number 83 overall, right? So the computer sees Gettysburg as a 60% favorite, favored by 2.5 in their matchup there in the first round.
Yeah, you expect an 8-9 type of a game to be an even matchup, and this one is fairly even at 60-40, but it's sort of flipped from what the seeding would expect. Gettysburg was a strong team in the Centennial Conference. Chatham was the pack leader, but the pack is not the strongest conference in the country. It's not as strong as the Centennial is. So yeah, the computer does like Gettysburg here as a favorite. Wouldn't be surprised if Chatham ultimately wins, but like a kind of like one possession type of a game here. So it will be a good game. But yeah, the computer is sort of bucking the trend of NPI and saying, well, I think Gettysburg is actually a little bit of a favorite here.
Similar dynamic in our next game here, Matt, maybe to an even greater degree, where Stockton is kind of slotted in as like a 5 seed against 12 seed Ithaca. Again, these are not necessarily official seedings, but just kind of how
Yeah.
they line up in the bracket. But the computer sees another even more even game than Chatham and Gettysburg, with Stockton a 57% win probability. This one, 2-point favorite according to the computer line. Stockton, the number 27 overall offensive team according to the efficiency ratings. Ithaca, tends to swing a little bit more on the
Yeah.
defensive side, with their defensive rating a little bit better than their offensive rating.
These are kind of the interesting matchups to me in the NCAA tournament. Is Stockton, like you said, does excel in the offensive end. Ithaca, one of those Liberty League teams. I feel like I mention it every time I talk about the Liberty League. To me, that's just like the epitome of a defensive league. All their team ratings are great on defense. You can see that looks like it's Ithaca's calling card. Their offense is just outside the top 100, but their defense is strong. So you get kind of an offense versus defense game, and it's always interesting to see which one wins in that regard. There's the adage that defense wins championships, but will that play out here? It's also interesting that even though this is a 5-12 matchup, it's also still fairly close by the computers. The NJAC had a bunch of strong teams. The computer doesn't necessarily see those teams like top 25, but it sees like in that next group, that 25 to 50, which even just as like if you think of distribution of teams is more tightly bunched than the top 25 are. So it seems like, oh, they're all the way at number 50. That must be low. No, there's not that much gap between like 25 and 50. There's a bunch of teams bunched up in there.
WPI gets Husson. WPI, for people who followed us, it seems like WPI over the last couple of years has been a team that the computer has really liked, maybe even more than like human voters or
Yeah.
just kind of the general fan tends to think. They enter the tournament here rated by the computer efficiency ratings at number 22. Another one of those teams, like, pretty good offense, just outside the top 100, but elite defensively, and they're in the top 10. Hassan, again, another one that skews towards the defensive end, but not quite there to that elite level, though they are in the top 100 defensively. This one is one that the computer sees as a 10-point favorite on the WPI side, giving them a win probability of 82%.
Yeah, it's always really interesting to me in the tournament, taking a team like Hassan, who's been a perennial favorite in the NAC. They've been in tournaments a bunch of times. I think they mentioned that on the live stream how many tournaments that Hassan has been into. But then they go against a kind of top 25 caliber team in the regular season NUMAC champion in WPI, and I'm always interested to see, can that weaker conference favorite maybe knock off a bigger kind of power top 25 team. I think this is another test for Hassan. They're definitely coming in as the underdog. 82-18 for the computer, though it's not that far out of the realm of possibility that they could pull up an upset. Definitely one to watch there.
Claremont Mudscripts will fly to New Jersey to take on host Ramapo. They're in a pod with Drew, but we did know ahead of time that Drew had not submitted paperwork to host. So this pod, if they were able to, not sure the reasons that they maybe didn't. Probably could have existed as is at Drew, but instead will be played at Ramapo. This one, the computer really sees as two teams evenly ranked. And I think it's probably one that is going to skew just based on that home court advantage, right? The Claremont Mudscripts Stags are rated number 35 by the computer, Ramapo at number 38. And CMS, that overall ranking number 35 is because they're pretty balanced offensively and
Mm-hmm.
defensively, even though none of those individually match that 35 ranking. 42 overall offensively, number 60 defensively, and little bit of a different split for Ramapo. The offense is number 80, number 31 defensively. So 2.5 points here on the computer line. So again, like that's kind of
Yeah,
right in
that's
what you have in there in the computer as the home court advantage, and that translates to a 58-42 split in terms of win probability.
yeah. So this game was hosted at Drew. The computer would see this as essentially a pick 'em. It probably would have been, yeah, almost exactly 50-50, let's just say. But really interested in this matchup. Of course, you get Southern California with a team from New Jersey, and two teams that are used to really big battles in their conference. The SCIAC usually goes 3, 4, or 5 teams deep as far as good quality competition. Teams that are often in the tournament mix. They have 3 teams in this year. A team that didn't make it this year, like Pomona Pitzer, has been in a lot of tournaments recently. We've noted on recent episodes, Zach, how top heavy the NJAC is, at least as far as like 4 teams that are in that tournament mix. So I like that dynamic of Ramapo versus Claremont Mudscripts. They're no stranger to having difficult conference battles. So now they're going to play a team from an opposite coast conference that has kind of a similar nature in their conference. And it's like an even matchup. So to me, this is like one of the more exciting things that we get to see in this country, in this tournament as teams come across the country. I'm sure CMS doesn't love the coast to coast flight, but that's what it's going to be. And I'm sure they're going to show up and get up for the game while it's there.
The other game there that pod Drew will take on Mary Washington, the upset winner in the Coast to Coast conference, entering with a 13-14 record, Matt. But they did claim that automatic qualifier. The computer really likes Drew, Matt. The number 13 team overall, an adjusted offensive efficiency rating of number 6 overall. And we haven't talked about that other column there, the adjusted tempo. Drew is one of the faster teams in the country. They play at a top 40 pace, right? So in terms of that adjusted offensive efficiency margin, like that's a tempo free number, right? So they are a really efficient offense who happens to play very fast, and that's a pretty good formula for putting up a lot of points.
Yeah. And just the first thing that stands out to me about this matchup is you look at the records 24-3 and 13-14. But then if you look over at where they rank by our computer on the adjusted efficiency margin, Mary Washington still shows up as a top 50 team. They play a difficult schedule. They play like Christopher Newport twice in coast to coast non-conference conference play. Then they played him again in the tournament. They beat him in the conference tournament. They end up playing a bunch of ODACs just because they need to fill like an entire non-conference schedule. To me, Mary Washington is not really afraid to play anyone. They'll take losses in the season, but they'll play a bunch of good teams. And they are a team, they have been the last several seasons, where their record might not blow you away at the end of the season, but they're a tough team. It's really interesting to look at this entire pod and see that by adjusted efficiency margin, our computer ratings has all 4 of these teams in the top 50 nationally. That's going to be a difficult pod. That's a tough draw for Drew. It's fair by NPI. So like again, the committee's not looking at adjusted efficiency margin. They're not supposed to look at that. Mary Washington is like a true 14 seed. Like that's a pretty good seeding there. But they happen to be, the computer thinks they happen to be a lot better than their resume suggests because they've lost games against top teams. So very fascinating. If you're looking for like the 4th team in a pod, like where's one spot where it could come out? It could be Mary Washington here, but that whole pod's good. So they're still like the lowest rated team in that pod, but they're maybe one of the best kind of like 4 seeds out there.
Good point, Matt. I think we're going to have an opportunity to talk about that same kind of line of thinking here in our next one, considering the discussion we had prior. But Guilford draws Barry. Guilford makes a really impressive run through the ODAC championship, another team that the computer sees as a top 50 team. I think at one point, Matt, this year, as we were looking at like kind of like what's going on with Guilford, their adjusted defensive number was not where we are used to seeing it for a Guilford team. And maybe it's still not there at number 100, but I feel like it was like in the bottom half of Division 3 at one point when we were looking. I don't know if you remember more specifically, but obviously that number's come way up and has probably been a big reason that the Quakers have been able to make their run into the tournament via the ODAC's automatic qualifier. And by the time they reached the final, they probably were going to be safe, for one of those last couple at-large bids had they dropped that final to Roanoke. But again, they get Barry, another top 100 team according to the computer. Barry, closing in on a top 50 ranking on offense, but the computer likes Guilford as a 62-38 win probability advantage and a 3.5 point favorite on a computer line.
Yeah, we had just talked about how by NPI, it looked like Huntingdon and Barry were flipped. By efficiency margin, this is appropriately seated, right?
It's probably exactly how you would set up the matchups in terms of the efficiency. Yeah. Let's just continue that.
Yeah.
Let's take a look, right? Because as you teased it, right? So Emory, the computer sees as the number 7 team, Huntingdon number 108, right? So if you want to order those 1 through 4 in terms of how the D3 Datacast computer sees them, based on efficiency rating, this is a perfectly seated pod.
Yep.
Which is again not the way it's supposed to go, and there's no reason to think that actually entered the equation here. But just kind of interesting how sometimes the nitpicks we can have, in terms of hashtag real basketball, end up working out just fine.
Yeah, and you look right? You look at NPI and you say, oh, this is fair, this is balanced. But then you look at the bracket by efficiency rating and you're like, well, this is the pot of death because all these teams are good. The committees obviously can't balance both of those, and they're only looking at NPI. They're not looking at Massey ratings or efficiency ratings or Jacob Shower ratings. They can't look at those, and it's impossible to balance by all of those things too. So right, we're only looking at NPI. Now we're running them through our computer and saying what might the matchups look like. But yeah, that Guilford Berry one, even though it looks more of like a mismatch by NPI seedings, could be a pretty good game when it comes down to real basketball. Emory Huntington, though, looks less so. Looks like Emory's a big favorite there. They had a great year in the UAA. Huntington won the CCS tournament title. They were in the mix, I think, a lot of the way in the regular season in the CCS as well, but they look like a pretty strong underdog there against Emory.
As you'd expect, as the number 2 seed in the bracket.
Yeah.
You look at the two biggest numbers, they go to the 1 seed and the 2 seed.
Yeah.
So that seems appropriate. So that's the Wesleyan quadrant, Matt. 3 more to go. Let's move on. I think we're going to talk about the quadrant headed by NYU first. They get Cortland in the first round. NYU, the computer rated as the number 3 overall team. The number 1 team offensively, though, and a top 5 defense to go along with it. Cortland ranks number 123 by the D3 Datacast computer overall. A pretty big split, 228 offensively, 53 defensively. But that'll be a tall task to try to slow down that NYU offense. The computer sees this as a 17 and a half point game with an overall win probability of 94% in NYU's favor.
Yeah, I think NYU's got great computer numbers across the board. They've been in that mix all season long, really since like the first couple of weekends. I think they showed up as one of the computer favorites, and they've largely stood there the whole entire season. When Cortland came up on the screen, I thought that they were a little bit. They maybe should have been a little bit too high of a seed for NYU, but really they're just like a 15, so this isn't terrible. It's not the worst. They still show up as heavy underdogs against NYU. So it'll be interesting to see what the SUNYAC AQ can do there. But as you mentioned, like offensive and defensive ratings, Cortland's defense does look strong, but NYU's just so good that their numbers right now look overwhelming in this matchup.
In this pod, because the NYU women will be hosting NYU men sent on the road in the first round, first weekend, that this pod will be hosted by York, Pennsylvania, where the host YCP gets John Carroll, Matt, in a pretty even matchup
Yeah.
that you throw that home court advantage in gets even tighter, and it maybe even flips it from a slight John Carroll favorite to a York favorite here. The computer sees John Carroll as the number 24 team, York 39th. And you look at those win probabilities of 48% on the John Carroll side, 52% on the York side, and just a half point favoring York, well within the home court advantage there.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think without home court, if this game was played at NYU, then maybe John Carroll does show up as 2-point favorites here, but it goes half points to York, Pennsylvania. Let's see if they can take advantage of that home court, right? That shifted site due to NYU's women also being great. Maybe they can take advantage of that against John Carroll, but that's about as even as you can get in the NCAA tournament. It's kind of a fun matchup too. I think there was just being able to get like a Midwest type team, an Ohio team like John Carroll into an NYU pod. I think that's kind of cool to do.
And the next one below that is the Region 10 pod, where we have Cal Lu flying to Texas to take on Hardin Simmons in a neutral court game. These games will be hosted at St. Thomas. And, Cal Lu survived an upset bid against Whittier, was not so fortunate against Claremont Mud Scripps. And that probably may have cost them some rights or a claim
Yeah.
to hosting a California pod, and instead this becomes a Texas pod, and they're on the flight heading out of Southern California. But the computer really likes what Cal Lu has done this season offensively, the top 10 offense. Defensively, outside that top 50, but a pretty even matchup here. Is they're a slight favorite against Hardin Simmons, who the computer likes as the number 61 team overall. Cal Lu with a 57% win probability, and the computer sees as 2-point favorites.
Yeah, Zach, you and I got to see that Cal Lutheran offense up close and in person back in November. They were certainly impressive there when they're hitting. Whenever I turn on a Cal Lu game, whenever I'm able to see one, it just seems to me like they're one of the best 3-point shooting teams in the country. I don't know if that actually bears out in the numbers. I haven't looked it up, but it just seems like they're like bang, bang, bang. They can make points in a hurry from the 3-point line. Harden Simmons has done a great job this season. I think they had a key injury early on that they kind of maybe some teams wrote them off. They've really ground their way back, grinded or ground. I don't know what is correct there. Winning the ASC tournament title, winning the ASC regular season, I believe as well. So they look strong down there. This could be a really good game. I really like how this pod ended up, by the way, and I think that Cal Lutheran Harden Simmons matchup is going to be a cool one to watch there.
St. Thomas gets the hosting rights after winning the SCAC. They will get Lewis and Clark, champions out of the Northwest Conference. And as you might expect for a team hosting and being in that kind of number 4 seed in a bracket, they're decent sized favorites here. 10.5 points on the computer line. The computer likes them 82% win probability compared to just 18% for Lewis and Clark. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah, you're always thinking about who's going to be able to host a Region 10 pod. 3 teams ended up in from Southern California, so you wonder, does that shift a pod to California? St. Thomas was the one, after winning the SCAC tournament championship, getting kind of in that true top 16 range. And with 2 teams in Texas anyway, it wasn't going to change the number of flights just to go to Southern California. At least here in Texas, we get to mix up the conferences as well and avoid those 2 conference pods that is just sometimes unavoidable, but no one likes it. But yeah, here you get a good matchup. 25-2 for St. Thomas. They're a team that has been kind of on the back ends of my top 25 ballot as a voter. The computer, despite that really kind of sterling record, the computer's been not really overall skeptical of them, but as a surefire top 25 team has been skeptical. Maybe the strength of schedule wasn't always there, but when push came to shove against teams such as Trinity, Texas in their conference tournament, St. Thomas, Texas did take care of business there. And do end up as the favorite here, especially in the first weekend in this pod. Lewis and Clark, kind of an upset winner in the Northwest Conference. You can see their record 12-11 do show up as a fair underdog here. So it'll be interesting to see if they can compete with the likes of St. Thomas, Texas. Like I said, I'm not always convinced in St. Thomas's strength of schedule this season. So can a team like Lewis and Clark, who had to get through the Northwest Conference, come up and bite them? We'll see.
We will see. TCNJ gets Pitt Bradford in the first round. TCNJ, one of those just solid NJAC teams. The computer likes them as the number 5 overall team. Just got a solid numbers, all top 100 offensively, defensively. 70% win probability favorites over Pitt Bradford. That's a 6-point favorite if you want to put a computer line on it, Matt. The thing that stands out with Pitt Bradford is they are one of the fastest teams in Division III basketball. Their adjusted tempo number there, number 3, right? So I just would have to guess that probably ranks behind like Grinnell and Greenville.
Greenville, probably, yeah.
I mean, it's a couple teams we'll have a chance to take a look at here later in the show. So
Yeah.
maybe I should have looked ahead to know for sure. But yeah, Pitt Bradford, in terms of like the tempo free numbers, it doesn't really, nothing in particular, whether it's their offensive number or defensive number really stands out. But when you're net positive both ways and you're playing a game that's going to have a lot of possessions, that is
Right.
another way to get the job done, right?
Yeah. Especially in a league like the AMCC, again, not the strongest league out there. If you're just increasing your number of possessions against maybe a team that's a little bit weaker, that might give you an advantage in the opportunities you can to overcome the other team. I mean, if they have a fast start or anything like that. Interested to see how they will compete against TCNJ. We talked about the NJAC a whole bunch. Those top 4 were really strong. They were locked down into like four bids into the tournament like all week going into the championship weekend. So really, really interesting matchup here. I think TCNJ has been on the national radar. Pitt Bradford is a team. Not really many AMCC teams have been on the national radar. TCNJ is the favorite, but it's 70-30. Really interested to see this matchup. I don't think, though, even though TCNJ is not necessarily fast themselves, I don't necessarily think of the NJAC as a conference that is a stranger to fast play necessarily. I don't. That's just I haven't looked at all the numbers again recently. I don't know if that was true this season, but I don't know that they will necessarily be shy away from that style of play or not be able to adapt to it. So it'll be interesting to see what Pitt Bradford's style of play can do in more of a national tournament type setting.
Hampton Sydney will host the pod, and they enter the tournament, with a top 10 offense, but that defensive number dragging them down a little bit to a number 20 overall ranking, much different spot than when they were entering the tournament a year
Yeah.
ago. But with this matchup here with Bryn Athyn, they're pretty heavy favorites, 96% win probability. The computer likes them by 19 and a half. And Matt, you look down at Bryn Athyn's adjusted efficiency margin number there, and the first time we see a negative number, which means the computer would have them in the bottom half, or a below average team when you're talking about the totality of the Division 3 men's basketball landscape.
Yeah, one of the lowest rating teams in the tournament here when it comes to efficiency ratings, and they're going up against the, I guess you would say, defending national runners up in the tournament. So that's a tough draw right there. Hampton City, yeah, as you said, not quite the team they were last year, but still a national top 20 team when it comes to efficiency margin. They've been in the top 10-ish in the top 25 poll for much of the season. So a really tough matchup here for Bryn Athyn, but a chance for them to get onto the national stage. I think it's their program's first time in the men's basketball tournament, if I am not mistaken. I think either way, the UEC final would have gone. I think was going to be the case. So it's good for them to be in this position as they continue to look to build their program. I know that's a program that is looking to build. The UEC is a tough place to do that because, as we've noted, it is not the strongest conference in the country. But getting into the tournament, playing a Hampton Sydney, it's at least, at the very least, it's a now we know what it looks like moment. And at best, it's a, hey, we pulled up the upset and we've shown that we can belong on this type of a stage.
And this is one we talked about, the seeding maybe not really working out true to that NPI ranking.
Yeah.
By NPI ranking, they really, we figured they would have been like a 16 seed,
Yep.
and the computer sees it that way. So, right, so different situation where we looked at the Emery pod, and it maybe the seeding didn't line up with the NPI rankings, but in terms of the efficiency margins, it kind of works itself out. That's not the case here, right? The D3 Datacast computer is in agreement with the NPI ranking there, where Bryn Athyn is probably slotted a couple seed lines higher than the ranking would warrant. All right, moving on. St. Joseph's Maine gets Redlands, and this is going to be a fast one. Let's just
Yeah.
jump straight to that tempo number where we've got St. Joseph's, the number 11 pace team in the country, Redlands number 9. So, this is one, Matt. We looked in our pick slate earlier in the season. We had the Greenville Grinnell game, right? And so, just out of curiosity, we took a look at what the computer total was on that. Usually we're just picking against the computer line, and that's what we picked in that game. But out of curiosity, I think it was like a 200, was it like
It was
241,
really
something
high.
like that.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly what it was, but just you get the two fastest teams in the country going at it. You're going to get a lot of points put up on the scoreboard. We've got two of the fastest teams in the country meeting up here. The computer likes St. Joseph's, Maine, as a 57-43 split there in terms of the win probabilities, and just 2 points on the computer line, and 2 points in a game that projects to have a whole lot of points scored is even fewer than it might seem in a game played at a
Yeah.
more normal pace.
And I'm always interested in how it is that teams play fast. Some teams play fast because they push it offensively. To me, Redlands is more of a team that plays fast because they pressure really well on defense and they force a lot of turnovers. When they're on offense, it's not that they're just jacking up a shot necessarily, playing fast that way. So it might be more of a turnover thing for them. The other thing I'm interested to see is, or just in the numbers here, you can see these two teams are both around the top 10 in adjusted tempo in the high 70s, but you look up at TCNJ's number or even Tufts number right below at like 70, and that's more that's more like 200. So you're only talking about like 8 or 10 possessions to get you from the middle of Division 3 to a top number. And you look at Pitt Bradford then at number 3 at almost 90 possessions. So I think there's a big tail at the top when you're talking about maybe some of these really fast teams like Pitt Bradford has been this year, or like Greenville is, or even Grinnell probably still is, compared to just like a nominally fast team like Redlands or St. Joseph's, Maine. So I don't think these are like system type teams, but they are willing to push the pace, play fast, maybe pressure you, force turnovers, gamble a little bit when necessary. So, but definitely I think that makes for a fun matchup, a definitely interesting to tune into this one just to look at what that's going to look like in this iteration of kind of two fast teams.
Hmm. And St. Joseph's, Maine, Matt, in the GNAC there, probably not a team that's been on as many radars as deserved. I know they're a team we took a look at earlier in the season when we were highlighting some teams that were not quite on the radar. I think that was probably our episode looking at some of the highest rated teams in the computer efficiency ratings that had not yet received top 25 votes. I believe they were on that list, if I'm remembering the exact episode correct. But yeah, good to see St. Joseph's, Maine into the tournament and drawing a very intriguing first round matchup. Okay, this one, next one, Matt, is one we've talked about. Tufts will be hosting Yeshiva. And this is a rematch of a game we saw earlier in the season. 19-point favorite for Tufts. Yeshiva has played not only Tufts, but this kind of team throughout throughout their non-conference, played a very difficult non-conference. Unfortunately for them,
They
those
lost
didn't
it.
always turn out to be very competitive games. The Macs looking to turn that around here in this matchup, drawing another NESCAC team and one they're familiar with from earlier this season.
Yeah, computer is saying 96% for Tufts and a 19 points projected scoring margin. It could turn out that way very much. I would have a hard time. I would if I'm picking against this line here, I'm probably picking Yeshiva to cover. But it's a 2-15 matchup. It's a big advantage for Tufts. They're big favorites here. I never quite know which Yeshiva team is going to show up from night to night necessarily. They had a big win, big conference tournament win, big shot over Farmingdale State. They're riding high right now. But interesting to see that the computer line still does end up that big.
All right, that's halfway through the bracket. Let's keep going. Let's try to get this thing done before the tournament actually tips off. Let's move on to the Platville quadrant. Platville gets Grinnell, and despite the fact that we talked about how, in terms of true seeding, Grinnell probably gets bumped down when it should have probably been Bethany Lutheran here. But despite that, the computer likes Platteville as a 99% favorite, computer line of 24.5. And yes, indeed, we do see Grinnell with the number 2 adjusted tempo number.
Yep. There it is. And I think 24.5, I think this is the largest computer line at this point in the tournament, but probably a lot of that is tempo based. We talk about a lot of possessions, so the line tends to get larger because every possession that Platteville plays against Grinnell, the computer thinks it's going to have a more and more advantage. So I think that's the reason why we see the biggest line. It's not the biggest mismatch, but it's going to be the fastest matchup among top seeded teams essentially. So that's why the computer likes Platteville by that much.
The other game there in Platteville will be Wisconsin Lutheran taking on Calvin. And the number that jumps out, Matt, Calvin really has been for quite a while now one of the elite defensive
Yeah.
teams. That's really keyed their big win streak here. They've been rising up the ranks here, ending the regular season as the 3rd ranked defensive team according to the adjusted defensive efficiency margin.
Yeah, Wisconsin Lutheran looking like more of a balanced team. We know that they're kind of senior laden. They've got a lot of seniors and 5th year type players on that team. And Calvin is not quite as balanced. They're defensively elite. They're one of the very best defensive teams in the country by these computer numbers. Offensively, though, they're just kind of pretty good. And that's how it's been this whole season. They are in that incredible run. 20 games in a row that they've now won. To put themselves in position winning that conference tournament title to get into the tournament here. And I think this is one of our more even matchups that we're seeing. It's a 55-45 game, 1.5 point computer line in favor of Calvin. So this is almost exactly a coin toss out there in Wisconsin. So it'll be a good one to watch.
Let's move to the Wash U pod, where first up it will be Denison taking on Franklin. Talk about balanced teams, Matt. Denison very balanced in terms of their offensive efficiency and defensive efficiency. They check in as a top 30 team, which pretty much checks with kind of where they've been in top, getting consideration there in the top 25. The computer likes them as 3.5 point favorites over Franklin. Maybe a little bit of a smaller number there than many would have expected, but about a 63-37 split in terms of win probability.
Yeah, Denison is a team that most of the season has been on the national radar. As you mentioned, they've been in that top 25 mix. They're a strong team. I think they're deserving of kind of that seeding that they get. Franklin is a team that I'll admit up until a couple of weeks ago snuck up on me. I didn't the way they snuck up on me is that in my simulations, I was getting a lot of simulations with 2 HCAC schools in the tournament because Franklin was more often than not, well, it's pretty close to 50-50 split, but more often than Anderson winning that conference tournament in my simulations, which was pushing Anderson into the Pool C mix, which before all the bid thieves, they were kind of in position to get one of those. And I thought that was weird until I started looking at the computer ratings and said, wow, the computer does like Franklin more than Anderson. And then they go out and they win that tournament. So this will be a very interesting one to watch. Franklin did sneak up on me. I don't think they're going to sneak up on anyone anymore in this tournament. But this is maybe a closer game than you might think if you just follow the top 25, you just follow the NPI and think Denison's going to be far and away the favorite. Computer says not so fast, my friend. It could be close to just like a one possession game.
And a team the computer really likes is WashU as a top 10 team overall, a top 10 offense, number 12 on defense, 15-point favorite there, according to the computer over Central, 91% win probability overall.
Yeah, they were not able to get one of those top 8 overall protected seeds, but by the adjusted efficiency margin, they are one of the top 8 teams in Division 3. WashU is really good. We know the whole UAA is really good. They've lost some games in that conference. They're only 19, I'll say only 19-6, but still top 8. You're playing really good teams. You're playing top 25, top 50 caliber teams every single night. Tough road trips. You're going to lose some games. So WashU, kind of a pretty heavy favorite in this one against Central, who kind of snuck up on the ARC to win that automatic bid. That means in the last 2 years, 5 different teams from the American Rivers have made the national tournament. 5 different teams in 2 seasons.
Next pod up, Matt, might be one of the more impressive pods overall that we've seen. Just taking a look, whether you're talking about the overall adjusted efficiency margin, adjusted offensive number, defensive number, a lot in there across the board, almost in the top 30. Number 10 by the D3 Datacast computer, St. John's taking on number 18 Chicago at a game at Chicago. So Chicago does have the slight home court advantage factored in there on the computer line, that where they are 1-point favorites, and 53-47 split in terms of the win probability. So another one of those that's about as close to 50-50 as we're going to get here in a first round matchup.
Yeah, and like one of the most difficult first round matchups here just by adjusted efficiency rating, right? We looked at this being pretty fairly seeded by NPI. Maybe what do we think? Chicago was maybe a little high there to be an 11, but not too bad. But now you look at it at efficiency rating standpoint, and these teams are both strong, both top 20 type teams. So going to be a battle there. That's a matchup that you might not see until like the Sweet 16 when you're talking about team strength. But again, NPI is not really a team strength metric. It's a team resume metric. And that makes kind of what ends up being a difficult matchup kind of more fair.
Same story for Illinois Wesleyan. Great numbers across the board, top 30 in terms of overall offensive and defensive numbers. Heavy favorites there over Bethany Lutheran, who we talked about probably being a little bit overseeded to avoid the rematches that they had during the regular season against Platteville and La Crosse. The computer likes Illinois Wesleyan by 20 and 97% win probability overall.
Yeah, Bethany Lutheran came in as, I think, what were they, the 4 seed in the UMAC and won that tournament. So that's kind of an underseed in one of the weaker conferences in the country, ends up being one of the lowest rated teams in the tournament. I think they're just above Bryn Athyn, as I just quickly paged back there. So they're the second lowest rated team in the tournament, and they draw Illinois Wesleyan here, which will be a tough matchup for them. Don't want to just assume an Illinois Wesleyan matchup. Don't think that they're going to want to look ahead to what the more difficult potential Sunday matchup is. But it looks like they're going to be heavy favorites there against Bethany Lutheran on Friday night.
Very interesting matchup up next. Maybe a little bit surprising to some. Carthage has not been as high in the digital eyes of the computer. Ranked number 57. They take on the team ranked right below them in St. Norbert, or excuse me, right above them in St. Norbert, 56, according to the computer. You take the number 57 team, the number 56 team, match them up. You got a 50-50 game, and it's a pick 'em.
I mean, who can say what number anyone is? I don't think we have any ability to talk about that here. All we know is that St. Norbert won the Northern Athletics Conference tournament against Wisconsin Lutheran, who's a good team. We've seen Carthage beat good teams in the CCIW. We've seen Carthage lose to good teams in the CCIW. I think this is just an interesting game, right? It's just going to be a good game. 2 strong teams in Wisconsin, playing in Wisconsin, and I think we're going to get a great matchup. The computer sees it as exactly 50-50, the most tightly contested first round game, I believe, by our digital computers. So those digital guys out there playing are still in overtime.
And it's a Wisconsin matchup taking place in Wisconsin because it's hosted at UW La Crosse, who draws Greenville, another fast team, the number one tempo team in Division Three, finishing off as we expected. We got the two teams that are officially running the system in Division Three, taking on two UW schools in the first round. After we talked about Grinnell taking on Platteville, Greenville's taking on La Crosse here. But unfortunately for hashtag the system, it's another big computer line, 24 points. As you mentioned, though, in terms of the number of projected possessions, that's going to inflate the number a little bit. 99%
Yeah.
win probability for La Crosse over Greenville.
And when I think of matchups against system teams like that, I want to think like, is this even though it's a good team, are they going to be just like, is it a lead-footed team with a bunch of bigs and they're going to not run the floor? I don't think that's UW La Crosse at all. We saw them in the GLI. I think they're going to be able to run
Yeah.
the floor just fine. I think that they'll adapt to Greenville's style of play just fine. You wonder if they're going to get worn out for the next night game, but they might just play 15 guys and get everyone a little bit of time, and it might be just fine. So I have no idea. Don't want to dismiss Greenville, but looking like UW La Crosse, 99% there. And I would pick straight up UW La Crosse to win that one. Zach, we've seen the committee protect against certain rematches, but that Grinnell Greenville sectional final they did not protect against.
They did not.
So we might be coming back to wonder about that later on.
One quadrant to go. That belongs to Trinity, Connecticut. They draw Newman out of the AEC for their first round matchup. Uh, Another big computer line, as you'd expect for a 116 matchup here. The computer likes Trinity over Newman by 26.5, 99% to 1%. So you're saying there's a chance.
I maybe misspoke earlier. This is actually This is even larger than the Platteville Grinnell computer line. So this is the largest computer line out there. Not
And
that it's a fast one.
Trinity enters as the number one ranked team by the D3
Yes.
Datacast computer.
After their win over Wesleyan, they actually jumped them in the efficiency ratings. So that was interesting to see. But yeah, this is the largest computer spread there. Not necessarily a fast game. 99% to 1%. Yeah, I don't completely want to dismiss Newman out of this one, but by the computer we have, and it's an obvious, right? It's like one of the number one seeds against the 16. You expect those to be mismatches, and I think it looks like this one is.
A more interesting one in the other game at that pod, Keene State will take on Clark, who made a run through the NUMAC championship to earn their way into the tournament. The computer likes Keene State as a 6-point favorite here, 71-29 split in terms of the win probability. Keene State, another one of those teams that plays towards the faster end, but even though Clark is maybe a little bit more towards average in terms of tempo, as you mentioned, sometimes the ranking in that tempo number can be a little bit more deceiving than the actual difference.
Yeah.
Where on a we're only talking about five, almost six possessions here.
Yeah. And the interesting dynamic here for Keene State and Clark is just my perception of the teams right now is Keene State looked a lot better early and then showed some susceptibility late. I think they looked good in the LEC tournament, but they lost a couple of games maybe later in the season. Clark was maybe a little bit the opposite. I think they lost some tough games earlier in the year, and they had maybe their most impressive win just more recently. I don't know if that's going to play into it. If Clark's now playing better than their efficiency rating, Keene State, I've been a little bit surprised all season long that their computer rating has stayed as high as it has. So I think if I was going to pick this game, I don't think this is on our slate, is it, Zach? If I was going to pick against this game, I might be more inclined to pick Clark against this line than Keene State, just based on I think they may be playing better now than the computer thinks.
In our picks contest, I'm the one who needs bonus picks, not you.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
let's not. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, next pod is going to be at Montclair State. Hamilton is another one of those NESCAC teams. The computer really likes Hamilton, the 5 seed here, but the computer likes them as one of the top 10 teams.
Yeah.
They draw Western New England. Hamilton is 69-31 favorite in terms of win probability. Put a computer line on it, and they're 5.5-point favorites. But Western New England, there the computer likes as the number 34 overall team. So maybe one of those sneaky good matchups here in the first round, where just don't pay any attention to the seeding or how the seeding might be suggested in terms of the bracket. This has the potential to be a good one.
Really good pod here, yeah. Hamilton, the computers loved them. My hesitation has been that it seems like they've just lost their most difficult games. We know they did take Wesleyan to double overtime though. They're good. They're within range of all these teams, so the computer likes that. Western New England, I think a sneaky team out of the CNE. We've seen Nichols come out of that conference and make a lot of noise in some seasons in the national tournament. Will be interesting to see if New England can do the same thing. The computer likes them quite a bit, so as a 5-12 matchup, this isn't really that big of a mismatch. Western New England's still like a top 35 type team by the computer ratings. Will be a fun one to see how this goes.
Another top 35 type team is Montclair State, one of those NJAC 4 that have been tightly grouped. They draw Utica in the first round out of the Empire 8. Computer, likes them 4 times out of 5, but of course, there's only one game to be played.
Yeah.
And we'll see what that actually looks like in terms of final score. But the computer likes the final margin of about 9 points there in Montclair State's favor.
Yep, Montclair State. We talked about how the NJAC winner was going to get one of those top 16 steeds, and it ended up being Montclair State here. They've earned that right to host. Number 31 overall by the efficiency ratings, and especially at home, they become almost a 10-point favorite here. And Zach, and I don't know what it is about Utica, but every year it seems like they're going to find their way into that tournament mix. Here they won the Empire 8 conference tournament, won the automatic qualifier, and I think that they're, even though they are the underdog here, they can be a dangerous team when they get into a situation like this.
You just don't have to worry about them ruining your Pool C projections anymore, right? Because
Not
we know
anymore.
that information going in.
Yep.
You don't have to make any guesses about regional rankings or how selections might actually go.
And they were Pool A this year, so it's fine.
Yeah, also that. All right, Pod, we've already talked a bit about here, Matt. Roanoke gets Pfeiffer here in the first round. The computer has really liked Roanoke all year.
Mm-hmm.
They are number 11 overall heading into the tournament based in the adjusted efficiency margin ratings by the D3 Datacast computer. Pfeiffer number 137. So that's where you get kind of the numbers you see all the way to the right there. 89% win probability for Roanoke, 13.5-point favorite.
Yeah, pretty strong favorites for Roanoke. Not a gimme putt here or anything like that, but pretty strong favorites. Roanoke's one of those really good teams because they're pretty balanced, top 25 in both offense and defense, so they look like a strong team. Pfeiffer not quite there at the same type of ratings as Roanoke, so they do look overmatched. Coming out of the USA South, winning the Pool A there, but will be interesting to watch nonetheless.
And with a 13.5-point computer line in that other game, we move on to the 18-point computer line in the other game involving host Christopher Newport taking on John Jay. So, Matt, this has the distinction of being the only pod with 2 first-round games that are double-digit,
Yeah.
computer line numbers here. So pretty heavy favorites, whether you're talking about Roanoke or Christopher Newport, who the computer likes as the number 12 overall team, right? So, don't want to project too much at this stage of the game, but we could see a second round matchup between Roanoke and Christopher Newport, who, before any updated numbers go in based on what happens in the first round, the computer sees as a matchup between the number 11 team and the number 12 team. Christopher Newport, 95% win probability, as we mentioned, 18-point favorite on the computer line.
It just so happens that the only pod in which we questioned the seeding of both the 3 and the 4 is the one in which they're both double-digit underdogs. It's sometimes funny how that works out. But yes, Christopher Newport does look like big favorites here as well. We've seen them in Final Fours in recent years. Just 2 years ago, they were national champions. They've been strong basically every season. Number 12 overall. We did just see them lose to Mary Washington, though, in the conference championship game. Although Mary Washington, despite their record, looked like a lot stronger team than John Jay. John Jay is big underdogs in this one, but Zach, they've overcome longer odds than that even just recently in advancing to the conference final and winning that conference final. So who knows what will happen for John Jay from here on out.
All right, they've got to be hold the distinction of the only team to have ever lost in their conference semifinal and gone on to win their conference automatic bid.
Probably
I don't know.
so.
I don't know if anyone can fact check that, but it seems like that's probably true. Okay, last pod here. Franklin and Marshall will host Catholic in one of the more interesting first round games because the computer likes Franklin and Marshall number 14 and likes Catholic as the number 23 team. But that still translates to Franklin and Marshall getting a 66-34 split advantage in terms of win probability, and the computer likes F&M as a 4.5 point favorite.
Yeah, a lot of that though is the home court advantage that they gain from Randolph
True.
Macon not
Yes.
being able to host. So
Yep.
this would be more like a 2 point game or just under that if this was more of a neutral court game. So Franklin
Or if this
Marshall
was
has that
actually
advantage. And
hosted if this was actually hosted at
yeah,
Randolph-Macon, right?
right,
Because this is one of
exactly.
those that was an alternate site, because the Randolph-Macon women have priority to host.
Yeah, but this, I think you're right. I think this looks like a really good game. Franklin and Marshall, to me, is one of those teams that has had a great, last 3 or 4 weeks. I think they were good all along. You have to be 21-6, but really the second half of the maybe like conference schedule, they really turned it on and took charge of that Centennial Conference there. So Franklin and Marshall looks great right now. Catholic is not going to be an easy matchup though. They've been pretty strong in the Landmark Conference. Couldn't really overcome Drew this season, but they've been kind of just on the outside or inside sometimes of that national top 25 picture as well.
Our last game to talk about here is with Randolph-Macon, the last top 8 protected seed for us to talk about. And similar to what we've seen with the others in the top 8, it's a big number there. 21-point favorites, according to the D3 Datacast computer. Randolph-Macon, um, the computer likes year in, year out because they're pretty
Always
good
good.
year in and year out. The number 4 overall team, top 10 ratings, both offensively and defensively.
I mean, the ODAC's one of the best conferences every year, and still Randolph-Macon wins that conference every single year. They're balanced offensively and defensively. They're great. They're just they're a tough out no matter what. Showing up as 21-point favorites here against Westfield State, the MASCAC champions. Going to be a tough matchup here for Westfield State as they travel down to F&M to play Randolph-Macon. At least this is not a true road game for them, but 21-point underdogs nonetheless. See if they can make some noise here, but it's going to be difficult for them.
Yeah, unlikely to ultimately turn out to be probably a very interesting game. But if you want to look at something that could be interesting, Randolph-Macon outside the top 400 in terms of tempo, Westfield State inside the
Yeah.
top 10. So unlikely that that really translates into any difficulty for Randolph-Macon, but we certainly have a contrast of styles there.
Yeah.
So that is the first round preview, breaking down all of the first round matchups. We will it'd be a lot of fun to see how it all plays out. You can play it out how the computer thinks it might go, or it might be more most likely to go. But of course, it's more fun to actually watch the games
Yeah.
as they're actually played and see what will happen on that given day.
All right, Zach, let's take a look at our individual picks from last week. We pick 5 games every single week. We run them through our computer, and then we pick against the scoring line that the computer spits out. We had we had conference tournament games last week, Zach. So we had Ramapo and Stockton. Ramapo were 3.5-point favorites. They were the home team. You had gone with Stockton, though. Ramapo does win that game by 7 points, so I got that point, which is going to be a trend. Gwynedd Mercy was playing at Marymount. Marymount was 3-point favorites. They won that game big, and we both got the point there. Guilford played at Virginia Wesleyan in what was the 4-5 matchup in the ODAC. Guilford, of course, went on to win the tournament. They were 7.5-point underdogs. They won the game by 13 against Virginia Wesleyan. We both got that point. Out in the NESCAC, it was Tufts and Trinity, Connecticut in, I believe, a semifinal there. 5.5-point favorites for Trinity. I picked Trinity. They won that game by 13, so I got that point as well. And our D3 Datacast game of the week was a regular season game between WashU and University of Chicago. WashU was 2-point road favorites there, but Chicago won that game by 8. We both picked Chicago, and we both got the points there. So let's check out the tally of the week, Zach. You went 3-2, which is not a bad week, climbing to 39, 42, and 4. But I went all 5-0 to go 44, 37, and 4 on the season. Surprisingly, we've had 4 computer pushes, but none this last week. So you still have some catching up to do on me, Zach.
Bring on the postseason.
All right.
I got some work to do.
All
It's
right. Well,
time to make a run.
speaking of the postseason, here are our picks for the first week of the NCAA tournament. First game is one that we talked about all of them. So it's Redlands versus St. Joseph's, Maine. Both teams were pretty fast. 2-point favorites for the home team, or not the home team, but on the right coast, coastally, they're the home team. St. Joseph's, Maine, 2-point favorites there. What's your pick?
They're at least playing in their home time zone, right?
Yeah.
But I'm gonna go with Redlands here. Give me the 2.
All right, Zach, you like Redlands plus 2 points. I do as well. I actually would probably like Redlands to win this game outright. So I'm happy to take the 2 points there. Next, we're going to a true pick'em by the computer. We talked about this one, Zach. St. Norbert and Carthage were right next to each other in the computer efficiency ratings, but who would you pick given this situation?
Well, given the situation, all your nerd stuff says it's a pick 'em, but I say it's an easy pick for Carthage here.
Well, Zach, I am known to be a Carthage supporter around these parts, so I'm going to go with you on this one. I'm going to pick the Firebirds. Carthage, likely to win this game in my mind in the Battle of Wisconsin teams and games played in Wisconsin, and I will pick Carthage as well. Catholic and F&M was a game we just got finished talking about as a notable game out there in the Randolph-Macon pod hosted at Franklin and Marshall. So this is one of those true home road games. Zach, who do you like, though, against that 4.5 computer line that favors Franklin and Marshall?
Yeah, the 4.5 is maybe making it a little bit interesting, but I'm gonna roll with the Diplomats.
I've been tending toward the Diplomats in recent weeks, but I think for me the 4.5 was just a little bit too big. I think this is going to be a good game, so I would go with Catholic to at least keep it close here. Another game that ends up being true home road in an alternate site game, I think we're having a little bit of a trend here in some of our pick'em games, is John Carroll at YCP. This is just a half a point game. YCP as the home team is the favorite, Zach, but what's your pick?
Yeah, this is one where I really feel like York's been pretty solid, maybe quietly pretty solid throughout much of the year. But at the same time, the conference has been a little bit down from what we've seen in recent years. I know that the computer ratings have a little bit of recency built in, so that
Mm-hmm.
I think that the fact that John Carroll's made this run is a bit of known information by the computer, as opposed to it leaning maybe too heavily on that earlier season segment where they were still kind of trying to figure out life without Luke Chacon. So it might be too dangerous to really put much stock in that narrative or that line of thinking. But I'm still going to go with John Carroll here.
Zach, I was going to have almost the exact same answer. You and I are very familiar with Calvin's big winning streak, and John Carroll doesn't have literally the same streak because I think they've dropped a game in there, but they have a very similar shape to their season. They came in with high expectations. There was a big player injury, so they had to figure out life without how they were going to adapt, and then really I think came on strong after that. And I'm gonna lean on that as well. They're going to be this is a true road game for them, but 5 point half a point underdog. I think that they can win this game, so I'm going to pick John Carroll as well. Our D3 Datacast game of the week looks like one of those really interesting ones. We just looked at the computer lines or the computer ratings and saw how close these two teams were. It's St. John's at Chicago in the alternate host site for the Illinois Wesleyan pod. It's just a 1 point line in favor of the host Maroons. But Zach, you get to make your pick first.
Yeah, not only close in terms of their rankings, but they're high up the list, right?
Yeah.
So um, yeah, Matt, I feel like um, it's maybe dangerous, going against a home team here on opening weekend. I did it once already, picking against York. I'm going to do it again here. Give me St. John's as a one
Okay.
point underdog. Both of these kind of turned out to be like pick 'em games, and I guess I'm going with the road team in both
Yeah.
instances.
I'm gonna go with St. John's as well. But here's my reasoning. My reasoning is I think Chicago has maybe shown a little bit more variance this year. They've been able to beat some maybe a little bit better teams, but they've also had a couple of games. They play in a tough conference, right? So conference losses aren't that bad for them. But they've some games where it's like maybe you could have won that game, or you could have played better there. I think St. John's is a little bit more steady Eddie. I think they're going to really kind of give you week in and week out what they're going to give you. And in that case, I'm going to rely on the steady team that's highly rated and being not quite sure maybe what I'm going to get from Chicago on any given night. I'm going to trust St. John's to give me the steady performance. 1 point line, we're basically saying who's going to win outright. So in that case, I'll pick St. John's. So that wraps up the picks, Zach.
That wraps up. So let's get out of here. Before we do, though, let's say thank you to our great supporters who have signed up for what we call a voluntary subscription on Patreon at patreon.com/D3Datacast. We've got a lot of information out there. All the computer ratings are on d3datacast.com. All of that information that kind of fed into the analysis that we walk through for all these first round games. All the computer lines, those are there on d3datacast.com on the daily predictions page. And of course, we were tracking those NPI numbers from day one, putting those numbers out fresh each day. That's all there on d3datacast.com with no requirement to log in as a subscriber or any ads encumbering the pages there. And we're able to do that because we've got a uh, great and growing group of people here who have chosen to support us along the way.
Yeah, incredible that there's all these names that have chosen to support us. We thank you so much. We love the D3 community. We love doing these episodes, and we can do it because of people like this. If you would like to join at either the $3 a month tier or the $5 a month tier, go to patreon.com/D3Datacast and join. We appreciate it so much. Zach, I've enjoyed this episode. We're going to enjoy the tournament. We're going to get out of here so we can watch some games or prepare for games later this week. We're going to say now, good job, team.